I thought I was building a life when I packed the last box into our apartment. Our apartment, the one with the yellow kitchen tiles I had chosen myself, and the window that faced the maple tree I had watched turn gold every autumn for 3 years. I had no idea that while I was carefully arranging our wedding photo on the mantelpiece with hands already swollen from pregnancy, my husband was at a hotel 2 miles downtown, making plans that had nothing to do with me or the child growing inside me. He was 29 years old, she was 23, and I was the last person in his life to know any of it. He didn't come home that night. He sent a text at 11:47 p.m. 11 words. No punctuation, no capital letters, no apology that meant anything. I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry, I'm leaving. I was 26 weeks pregnant. I was sitting on the bathroom floor when I read it because my back had been aching all evening, and the cold tiles against my spine were the only thing that made it bearable. I remember the way the screen lit up in the dark bathroom, the way his name appeared at the top of the notification, the way I opened the message thinking he was telling me he'd be home late, maybe that he'd stopped for takeout or gotten stuck at the office. I remember the lavender candle I'd lit earlier in the living room to make the new apartment smell like home, still burning somewhere down the hallway, sweet and oblivious. The maple tree outside had just started to shed its leaves. I stayed on that bathroom floor for a very long time. His name was Daniel. We had been together for 4 years, married for 2. He was the kind of man who remembered your coffee order without being reminded and fixed things around the house without being asked. The kind of man who held your hand at funerals and always answered the phone when you called. Or at least, that's what I had believed for a very long time. Looking back now, I can see the cracks that I mistook for character. The nights he came home distracted, his eyes already focused somewhere beyond the room, the way he'd grown quieter in the months since I'd told him about the pregnancy, a subtle pulling away that I had attributed to stress and fear and the ordinary weight of impending fatherhood rather than to what it actually was. I had spent 2 years being married to a man who was, in some fundamental way I couldn't yet articulate, already leaving. I simply hadn't understood the direction he was heading. We had met at a company networking dinner that neither of us wanted to attend. He worked in logistics. I was in marketing. We ended up at the same round table near the back, hemmed in by people who kept exchanging business cards with the hungry efficiency of people who believe that's how lives are changed. He made a quiet joke about the poached salmon, something about its expression of resigned defeat. And I laughed louder than I'd intended, and then felt embarrassed about laughing. And he looked at me with that sideways half smile that I would spend the next 4 years thinking was the most honest thing about him. By the end of the evening, we had exchanged numbers. By the following weekend, we had plans. The ease of it felt like a sign. In retrospect, it was simply ease, which is not the same thing. His mother, Eleanor, had welcomed me with an enthusiasm that I found slightly overwhelming, but chose to interpret as love. She was a compact, carefully put-together woman in her late 50s. With silver hair she wore in a precise chignon and a way of tilting her head when she listened that made you feel like the most important person in the room. She told me at our 3rd meeting that she had always known Daniel would find someone wonderful, and she said it in a way that made me feel chosen rather than evaluated. She helped me plan the wedding flowers. She cried at the ceremony, real tears, the kind that smear mascara and have to be dabbed with a linen handkerchief. And she hugged me afterward for a long moment and whispered that she was so glad. I believed every word of it. I wanted to believe every word of it. She was the mother I hadn't had in the way I'd needed, and I walked into that relationship with the particular blind gratitude of someone who doesn't yet understand that warmth, like any resource, can be weaponized. What I didn't understand in those first years was that Eleanor's affection was conditional in ways I had not yet discovered. She loved me when I was Daniel's devoted wife. She needed me when I was the vessel for her future grandchild. But when Daniel left, when that 11-word text arrived at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and I stayed on the bathroom floor until the lavender candle burned itself out, Eleanor's warmth vanished so completely and so cleanly that it was as though it had never existed. She did not call. She did not come to the apartment. She did not send a message, not one, asking about the baby or about me or about what Daniel had done and why. For the last 3 months of my pregnancy, the heaviest, loneliest, most terrifying stretch of my life, Eleanor was simply absent, and her absence had a texture, a weight, a specific gravity that pressed on me in the same way Daniel's absence did, but with a different kind of sting, because I had not expected it from her. My daughter was born on a Thursday in February, during a snowstorm that coated the hospital parking lot in 6 inches of white and made the world outside the delivery room window look muffled and unreal. I named her Lily. She weighed 7 pounds, 2 ounces. She had Daniel's eyes, that particular shade of gray-blue that shifts depending on the light, darker near windows, almost silver in lamplight. And for the first several weeks, I struggled to look directly at her face without being undone, because the resemblance was precise and persistent and arrived without warning at the worst moments. My mother flew in from Portland for the birth and stayed for 6 weeks, which was the most generous thing she has ever done for me. And she was extraordinary in the way that practical, no-nonsense women become extraordinary in a crisis. She did the laundry and cooked enormous pots of soup and held Lily through the 3 a.m. hours when I was too hollowed out to function. But she had her own life, her own responsibilities, and when she left, I was alone with the yellow kitchen tiles and the bare maple tree and a baby who needed everything. The child support arrangement was reached without much drama, which surprised me until I understood that drama requires investment, and Daniel had already redirected his entirely. His lawyer communicated through my lawyer. I never spoke to Daniel directly during that period. We arrived at a figure that was technically adequate, enough to keep the apartment, enough to afford childcare when I returned to work, and emotionally devastating in the specific way that reduces 4 years of a shared life to a column of monthly transfers. He had moved in with her. Her name was Kayla. I learned this not from Daniel, but from a mutual friend who delivered the information with the careful urgency of someone removing a splinter. Kayla was 23, worked in graphic design, had no children, and no desire for them, which gave Daniel's departure a particular shape. He hadn't left because fatherhood frightened him. He had left because I did, or at least, that was the version I lived with for a long time, turning it over in the dark like a stone I couldn't put down. I did not hear from Eleanor for 8 months. Not a card. Not a text, not a single inquiry through any channel about Lily's health or her weight or the color of her eyes. I told myself it was grief, that Eleanor had lost something too when Daniel left, that she was navigating her own complicated terrain of loyalty and shame, that she simply didn't know how to reach across the wreckage. I was generous in my interpretation because generosity was the only currency I still had in abundance. I even composed an email to her once, in the small hours of a sleepless night when Lily was 4 months old, and I was running on caffeine and stubbornness, telling Eleanor that Lily was well, that she was growing, that she was welcome in our lives whenever she felt ready. I never sent it. I wasn't sure I meant the last part enough to put it in writing. Then, when Lily was 7 months old, when I had returned to work part-time, when I had found something resembling a rhythm, when I had stopped crying in the car every morning on the way to the office and started crying only occasionally on bad days in parking lots, Eleanor called. Her voice was exactly as I remembered it, warm, slightly breathy, with that particular deliberate cadence that made everything she said sound like a confidence being shared between two people who understood each other. "Clara," she said, "it's Eleanor. I've been thinking about you so much. I've been thinking about the baby." There was a pause. Not a guilty pause, not a hesitant one, but a practiced one. The kind that precedes a sentence that has been carefully rehearsed. "I'd love to see her. I'd love to see Lily. She's my granddaughter, after all. Whatever happened between you and Daniel, she's still my granddaughter." I stood in my kitchen looking out at the maple tree, which had made it to early spring by then, the first pale green of new leaves just barely beginning to uncurl at the tips of the branches, and I felt something complicated move through me. Something that was relief and suspicion in equal measure, hope, and the specific wariness of someone who has learned to distrust hope. I said yes. Of course I said yes. Lily deserved a grandmother. I believed in that moment that I deserved some version of the family I had thought I was constructing. And Eleanor arrived the following Saturday with a cashmere blanket for Lily in the softest shade of cream and a good bottle of white wine for me. And for several hours, she was everything I had missed. Attentive, warm, funny in the dry, understated way she had always been funny. Tender with Lily in a way that seemed genuine rather than performed. She held my daughter with the practiced ease of someone who had raised a child and remembered every instinct, and Lily, who regarded strangers with a solemn wariness that I found both amusing and heartbreaking, leaned into Eleanor's arms without resistance. It should have made me happy. It did make me happy in the uncomplicated sunlit surface layer of that afternoon, with the wine breathing on the counter and the cashmere blanket pooled in Eleanor's lap and Lily's small, serious face tipped up toward her grandmother's. But underneath, in the place where I had quietly been educating my instincts over 7 months of survival, something was already paying close attention. Something was already waiting to see what Eleanor was actually here for. That was 5 years ago. 5 years in which I rebuilt everything. My confidence, my finances, my sense of what I was owed and what I was capable of. 5 years in which Lily grew from an infant who looked too much like her father into a small, fierce, laughing girl with my mouth and his eyes and an entirely her own stubbornness that I recognized as coming from neither of us. 5 years in which Eleanor came for visits and remembered birthdays and sent gifts at Christmas and established herself, slowly and methodically, as a fixture in our small life. I trusted her. I'm not ashamed of that. I trusted her because she gave me reasons to, and because I needed to, and because I had not yet understood what Eleanor was building in the space of my trust. I had not yet understood that patience is not always a virtue, that sometimes patience is a strategy, and that Eleanor had been patient in the particular way of someone who is waiting for exactly the right moment to collect what she believes she is owed. The warning signs, when I look back at them now, were not subtle. They were simply patient, arriving at intervals long enough that each one could be dismissed on its own, explained away, filed under the category of misunderstanding or coincidence, or the ordinary friction of an unconventional family arrangement. Eleanor was good at that. She understood intuitively that a single large alarm triggers a response, but a series of small ones spread across months can be absorbed without action. She played the long game with the precision of someone who had planned for it. It started with questions about the apartment, not aggressive ones, never aggressive, not with Eleanor, not in that phase. They were curious questions, innocent-sounding questions, the kind you ask when you're interested in someone's life and want to understand it better. How much was the rent? Was it going up? Was the landlord reliable? Had I thought about buying rather than renting? She asked these things over tea at my kitchen table, with Lily on her lap and her silver head tilted at that particular angle that made everything feel like a conversation rather than an interrogation. I answered honestly because I had no reason not to. I told her about the rent increase I'd absorbed the previous spring, the savings account I'd been building steadily since returning to work full-time, the promotion I was angling for that would make a down payment more realistic within a year or two. I told her everything. I spread my financial life on the table between us like a hand of cards, and Eleanor listened with warm, attentive eyes, and I remember feeling grateful to be heard. The questions about Daniel came a few months later, also innocent, also careful. How was the child support arrangement working? Was he consistent with payments? Did he see Lily regularly? I told her the truth. Daniel was inconsistent with visits. He would commit to a schedule and then cancel at the last moment with vague excuses that Lily was too young to understand, but old enough, I thought, to register in some wordless way that her father's presence was unreliable. The child support came on time, which I acknowledged with a fairness that cost me something each time I said it. Eleanor listened to all of this with an expression of sympathetic concern, shaking her head slowly, murmuring that it was a shame, that Daniel had always struggled with follow-through, as though his abandonment of his pregnant wife was simply a manifestation of a minor personality flaw she had been working on for years. I noticed that she never said she was sorry. I noticed and filed it away and said nothing. The shift, the first real shift, the one I could not entirely explain away, happened on a Sunday afternoon in October when Lily was nearly 3. Eleanor had come for what had become our established monthly visit. She arrived around 11. We had lunch. She spent the afternoon with Lily while I worked or cleaned or simply sat in another room and let myself exist without managing anyone. It was an arrangement I had come to value, and I think that is important to say plainly. Eleanor gave me something real during those years. She gave me relief and respite, and a witness to Lily's growing up who cared about the details in the way that only family cares about them. Whatever came later, that part was real, and it cost me something to lose it. On that Sunday afternoon in October, I came into the living room to find Eleanor on the floor with Lily, building something elaborate out of wooden blocks, and I stopped in the doorway because the sight was genuinely lovely. Lily's concentrated frown, her small hands placing each block with tremendous seriousness. Eleanor's patient attention. And then I heard Eleanor say, in a quiet conversational tone, as though she were simply continuing a thought, "This is a nice apartment, isn't it, sweetheart? But Grandma thinks you'd be happier somewhere bigger, with a yard, maybe closer to Grandma." Lily said something incomprehensible about the blocks. Eleanor glanced up and saw me in the doorway, and her expression didn't change. Not guilty, not caught, just placid and warm, the same expression she always wore. I was just telling her about the house on Birchwood, Eleanor said. An old friend of mine is selling. Beautiful yard. I thought maybe we could all look together sometime. She smiled. I smiled back. I said something non-committal about maybe looking at some point. But in the car after she left that evening, Lily drowsing in the car seat behind me, I sat in the parking space for 10 minutes with the engine idling, trying to name the feeling in my chest. It took me a while to identify it as dread. After that, I started paying a different kind of attention. Not paranoid attention. I want to be precise about that because one of Eleanor's eventual strategies was to characterize my awareness as instability, and I refused to grant that framing even in retrospect. It was not paranoia. It was pattern recognition, the slow assembly of a picture from fragments that individually meant little, but together suggested something I wasn't yet ready to name. I noticed that Eleanor's questions about my finances had become more specific. Not just general curiosity, but targeted inquiries about my savings total, my employer's policy on leave, whether I had updated my will since Lily was born. I noticed that she had begun arriving for visits with information about real estate. Printouts, sometimes folded in her purse, which she would produce with casual offhandedness. I just thought this was interesting. I wasn't suggesting anything. I noticed that she had started asking about Daniel more, and with a different texture than before. Not sympathetic sighing about his failures, but something more precise, more careful. How was he doing? Was he still with Kayla? Had I spoken to him recently about Lily's school plans? Had he mentioned anything about custody arrangements? I asked her directly once. It was March. Lily had just turned 4, and we had celebrated with a small party at my apartment. Balloons and a lopsided cake I had made myself from a recipe online. 3 of Lily's friends from daycare and their mothers crowded into my living room. Eleanor had come early and stayed late, and as she was putting on her coat in the hallway, I said casually but carefully, "Eleanor, is something going on? Something I should know about?" She looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Something behind the warmth, something watchful and appraising that was there, and then gone so quickly I almost missed it. Then she touched my cheek with one cool, dry hand and said, "Of course not, sweetheart. I just worry about you both. That's what grandmothers do." She left. I locked the door behind her and stood in the hallway for a while, listening to Lily dismantling the balloon decorations in the living room, and I thought, she didn't answer the question. She answered a different question, a warmer, softer one that she had substituted for mine, and I had let her do it, and I had no idea why. The answer arrived on a Tuesday in November, 7 weeks after that party, in a way I had not anticipated and could not have prepared for. Lily was at daycare. I was working from home. I'd taken the day off my usual office schedule to meet a deadline on a campaign proposal, and around 2 in the afternoon I went to the kitchen to make coffee and found Eleanor's reading glasses on the counter. She had been over the previous Friday and must have left them. I picked them up, turned them over in my hand, thought about texting her. Then I thought, she left her glasses, she might need them. She has a spare set at home and probably doesn't need them urgently, but I could check if any of her other things are here in case I need to drop something off. It was this small, entirely reasonable chain of thought that sent me back to the living room to check whether she'd left anything else, her scarf, her reading material, anything that might indicate she'd need a drop-off rather than a pickup. What I found was not a scarf. It was a folder. A brown manila folder, the kind you buy in office supply stores, the kind that looks aggressively ordinary, tucked between the cushion and the arm of the sofa. I picked it up thinking it might be something of Lily's, a daycare art project, a printed photo. I opened it. The first thing I saw was a document with a header I recognized. It was from a family law firm on the other side of the city, a firm whose name I had seen in an article about custody disputes. Below the header was a date, 3 months prior, and below that was my name and Daniel's name, and a series of paragraphs that I read standing in the middle of my living room, still holding my coffee mug, while the world outside the window continued with total indifference to what was happening to me. It was a custody petition. Daniel was seeking full legal custody of Lily. The grounds cited were, among other things, financial instability, housing insecurity, and what the document described as a pattern of emotional volatility in the primary caregiver, which was me, described in language so clinical and detached that it took me several readings to understand that I was the person being characterized as unfit. There were specifics: the rent increase I had mentioned, absorbed and managed, the savings account balance I had disclosed over tea, the promotion timeline I had laid out with such open, trusting detail. There were observations about my emotional state, references to a conversation at a birthday party in which I had, apparently, expressed frustration about Daniel's canceled visits in front of other parents, which was characterized not as understandable venting, but as evidence of a destabilizing pattern. Every piece of information I had given Eleanor over 2 years of kitchen table conversations was in this document. Every number, every confession, every moment of vulnerability I had shared over tea with Lily on her lap. All of it had been collected, cataloged, and handed to a lawyer, building a case against me. My coffee mug was on the floor. I didn't remember putting it down or dropping it. The carpet was wet beneath my feet, and I could smell the coffee, but the smell was very far away, as though the distance between my body and my senses had expanded without warning. My hands were holding the folder, and I could see them shaking. A fine, rapid tremor, the kind you associate with cold or fear, or the moment after a car accident when the adrenaline has passed and the body accounts for what just happened. My heart was beating in my throat. I sat down on the sofa in the exact spot where the folder had been hidden, and I read every page. There were 11 pages. I read them twice. On the second reading, I noticed a detail I had missed on the first. In the section listing the petitioner's supporting witnesses, there were 2 names. The first was Daniel's. The second was Eleanor's. She had not just passed along information. She had signed a document. She had agreed to be a witness in a custody case designed to take my daughter from me. She had held Lily in her arms every month for 5 years, had sat at my kitchen table and asked about my savings and my rent and my emotional state, had arrived with cashmere blankets and white wine and the practiced warmth of a woman who had been playing a very long, very patient, very deliberate game, and she had taken everything I had given her and built a weapon from it. Every cup of tea, every honest answer, every unguarded moment, all of it had been material. All of it had been collected for this. I sat on the sofa with the folder in my lap and the coffee soaking into the carpet and Lily's crayon drawings covering the wall in front of me. Her name in enormous lopsided letters across the bottom of the largest one, the way she wrote it now with tremendous pride in the L. And I felt something move through me that I had no name for then and can only partially describe now. It was not quite rage, though rage came. It was not quite grief, though grief was underneath everything. It was something colder and more fundamental, the specific, terrible clarity of a person who has just understood that they have been a target for a very long time and mistook the targeting for love. The silence in the apartment was complete. The maple tree outside, bare again, November bare. The same tree I had watched through every season of Lily's life was perfectly still. I looked at my daughter's name on the wall. I looked at it for a long time, and then I picked up my phone. The first call I made was to my friend Renata. Not because she was a lawyer, she wasn't, but because she was the one person in my life who had never once told me I was overreacting, who had sat across from me in the early days after Daniel left and said, with the flat precision of someone who had watched me suffer without flinching, "He's not confused, he's just a coward." I needed that voice. I needed someone who would not soften what I was about to say into something more comfortable. She answered on the second ring, and I said, "Eleanor has been feeding information to Daniel's lawyer. She wants to help him take Lily." There was a silence on her end, not stunned, not disbelieving, but the silence of a person rapidly updating their understanding of a situation they had been watching for years. Then she said, "Okay, don't call Eleanor, don't call Daniel, don't move anything, don't delete anything. I'm going to give you a name." The name was Margaret Osei, a family law attorney whose reputation Renata had encountered through a colleague's divorce 2 years prior. I called her office that same afternoon, still sitting on the sofa with the folder in my lap, and her assistant gave me an appointment for the following morning. I spent the rest of that day in a state I can only describe as controlled dissociation. Picking Lily up from daycare, making her dinner, reading her a story about a rabbit who lost something important and found it again, watching her fall asleep with her small fist curled against her cheek, while underneath all of it my mind was running the folder's contents on a continuous loop, turning each detail over with the relentless mechanical quality of something that cannot stop. I did not sleep. I lay on my side in the dark and listened to the radiator tick and the city murmur 3 floors below and the entirely ordinary sound of my daughter breathing in the next room, and I thought about what Eleanor had done with 5 years of my trust, and I made a decision that settled over me with the weight and temperature of cold metal. I was not going to lose. Margaret Osei was a small, very still woman in her early 50s with close-cropped natural hair and the quality of attention that reminded me of a surgeon. Precise, unhurried, entirely focused on what was in front of her. I gave her the folder across her desk the next morning, and she read it without expression while I sat in the chair opposite and tried to control my breathing. When she finished, she looked up and said, "This is detailed. How long has his mother been visiting?" I told her everything. The 5 years of visits, the questions about finances, the real estate printouts, the birthday party conversation, the question I had asked directly in the hallway, and the non-answer Eleanor had given me. Margaret listened to all of it and made precise, unhurried notes. Then she said, "She left this folder in your apartment." I said yes, and she knew she'd left it. I paused. Yes, I think so." Margaret nodded, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. "Then she wanted you to find it," she said. "The question is why?" That question opened something I hadn't considered, a new layer beneath the one I'd already found, colder and more calculated. Eleanor had not accidentally left the folder. Eleanor did not do things accidentally. She had left it deliberately on a Friday visit, 3 days before the petition was scheduled to be formally filed. She had wanted me to find it before it arrived through official channels, wanted me to panic, to react, to call Daniel and say something that could be used, or to call her and say something that could be recorded, or to do something that would confirm the characterization of emotional volatility that the petition was built upon. It was a trap laid inside a trap. and I had found the folder on a Tuesday, called a lawyer on a Wednesday, and walked into Margaret's office on a Thursday morning with the folder intact, and my reaction documented nowhere but my own kitchen floor. Eleanor had miscalculated by approximately 72 hours. Margaret filed a response to the petition within the week. In the meantime, she advised me to do 3 things. Document everything I could remember about Eleanor's questions and visits. Continue my normal routine without any contact with either Daniel or Eleanor, and call my employer's HR department to formally document my recent promotion, which had come through 6 weeks prior and which the petition had conspicuously failed to mention. That last detail mattered. The petition referenced my financial position as it had been 18 months ago, before the promotion, before the raise, before I had quietly and methodically built the stability that Eleanor's kitchen table intelligence gathering had been tracking, and then apparently stopped tracking or had been filed without updating. It was a gap, and gaps are what cases turn on. I called my mother that night. She had never liked Eleanor, which I had always attributed to the territorial instinct of one mother around another, and had been slightly impatient with her about it over the years. I owed her an apology for that impatience, and I gave it to her, and she accepted it with the grace of a woman who had been right for a long time and understood that being right is not always satisfying. She asked what I needed. I said, "Come. Not yet, but soon. I'll tell you when." She said she would be on the first flight. The confrontation with Eleanor came 11 days after I found the folder, and I want to describe it carefully, because it was nothing like what I had imagined during those 11 days of preparation. I had imagined rage, mine, hers. I had imagined raised voices, slammed doors, the operatic collapse of something that had been built over years. What actually happened was quieter and more devastating, and in some ways worse. Eleanor arrived at my door on a Saturday morning, unannounced, which she had never done before, carrying a tote bag with what appeared to be groceries and wearing the expression of someone who has decided to be reasonable and wants credit for the decision. I had known she might come. I had thought about not opening the door. I opened it. "I think we need to talk," she said. Her voice was measured, concerned, the voice of a woman managing a situation. I stepped back and let her in, and she came into the apartment and set her tote bag on the kitchen counter and turned to face me with her hands clasped in front of her. And I thought, she still believes she can manage this. She still believes I'm the woman who answered her questions over tea and felt grateful for the attention. "I know you found the folder," she said. "I think that's probably for the best. I think it's time we were honest with each other." I said nothing. I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, and I looked at her, and I said nothing at all. And I watched something flicker behind her eyes. Uncertainty, the first trace of it, brief as a shadow. "Daniel loves Lily," she said. "He wants to be in her life. He wants to give her a stable home. Clara, I know this is hard to hear, but I think you need to consider what's genuinely best for her." She paused. "We're not trying to take her from you. We're trying to find a better arrangement for everyone." "You signed a custody petition," I said. My voice was level. It surprised me how level it was. "You sat at this table for 5 years and asked me questions about my rent and my savings and my emotional state, and you wrote down everything I told you, and you gave it to a lawyer whose job was to take my daughter away from me." Eleanor's expression shifted, the warmth dimming, the mask reconfiguring itself into something that was still controlled but no longer warm, just controlled. "I was trying to help," she said. "You've been struggling, Clara. I've watched you struggle. I wanted Lily to have stability. You didn't ask me, I said. You didn't say, Clara, I'm worried. Can we talk about this together? You built a legal case against me while you were sitting in my living room holding my child. There was a silence. Eleanor looked at me for a long moment, and I could see her assessing, calculating the distance between where she was and where she needed to be, the way she always had, always calculating. What do you want? She said. Not a question, a negotiation opening. I want you to withdraw, I said. I want you to contact Daniel's lawyer and remove your name from that petition and withdraw your offer to testify. I want that done by Wednesday. Something moved across Eleanor's face, a compression, a tightening around the eyes and mouth, the expression of a person who has encountered an unexpected resistance in terrain they believed they understood. Clara, she said, and the warmth was gone now, entirely gone. The voice that remained was something older and harder and more precise. You don't understand what Daniel can bring to this. There are things in your history, things about your mental health treatment several years ago, that will come out in any contested proceeding. I'm trying to protect you from that. She said it quietly, as though it were a kindness, as though the blade were a gift. I had been waiting for this. I had discussed it with Margaret because Margaret had asked me whether there was anything in my history that Daniel might use, and I had told her about the therapist I'd seen for 18 months after Daniel left. Not a crisis, not an instability, but the entirely ordinary and responsible decision to seek professional support after my marriage collapsed while I was pregnant. Margaret had looked at her notes and said, "That's a strength, not a weakness, and any judge who's been on the bench for more than 6 months will see it that way." I had written that down. I had carried it with me into this room. "My therapist," I said, "will be happy to testify. My employer will provide documentation of my performance and my recent promotion. My daughter's pediatrician, who has seen her every 3 months for 5 years, will confirm that she is healthy, secure, and well attached to her primary caregiver, which is me." I watched Eleanor's face. "My attorney has also filed a motion requesting that your communications, texts, emails, and the notes you apparently kept about our conversations be produced in discovery. You kept notes, Eleanor. You're thorough. I'm counting on it." The silence that followed was the longest of the entire conversation. Eleanor stood at my kitchen counter, and I stood in the doorway, and we looked at each other, and the morning light came through the window that faced the maple tree and lay flat and cold between us on the kitchen floor. "You talked to a lawyer," she said finally, "before you talked to me." "Yes," I said. "I learned from the best." She left without the groceries. I stood at the window and watched her cross the parking lot below and get into her car and sit there for a long moment before pulling out. She had not cried. Eleanor never cried unless it was strategic, and this situation had moved beyond the reach of strategy. For the first time in 5 years, she had encountered something she hadn't planned for. She had planned for my panic. She had planned for my silence. She had planned, I think, for my devastation. She had not planned for my lawyer. Daniel withdrew the petition 14 days later. Margaret sent me the notification on a Wednesday afternoon, and I was at my desk at work when I read it. And I excused myself to the hallway and stood there for a few minutes with my back against the wall and my eyes closed, breathing. It was not the triumphant feeling I had imagined during those weeks of preparation. It was quieter than that, a release, a slow unclenching, the particular exhaustion of a person who has been braced for impact for so long that the absence of impact is itself disorienting. My mother, who had come as I'd asked and was staying with Lily, sent me a voice message that made me cry in the hallway in a way I'd been too controlled to cry before. Just her voice, saying my name, saying she was proud of me, saying that she had always known I was strong enough even when I hadn't known it myself. Eleanor did not contact me again. I heard through a mutual connection, months later, that Daniel and Kayla had separated, and that Eleanor had moved to a smaller apartment closer to Daniel's new place, and that she had told people in her social circle a version of events in which she had been trying to help and been misunderstood. I did not expend energy being angry about that. The version she tells is not the version the documents tell, and documents do not change with the telling. What I want to say about the aftermath, about the months that followed the petition's withdrawal, the spring that came after that terrible autumn and winter, is that the healing was not dramatic. It did not arrive in a single moment. It came the way most things that matter come, incrementally, in small dailiness, in the accumulation of ordinary mornings. It came in the way Lily began to thrive in her new kindergarten, in the way she brought home drawings of our family. Just the two of us, rendered in crayon, with an enormous sun above and a maple tree to one side, our names spelled in her enormous letters underneath. It came in the way I finally allowed myself to stop waiting for the next disaster and begin, tentatively and with the practiced caution of someone who has been hurt by trust, to trust again, not blindly, never blindly again, but genuinely, with my eyes open and my instincts intact. The apartment still has the yellow kitchen tiles. I did not move, in the end. I bought it, actually, when the landlord sold the building the following year, because Margaret had helped me understand that my financial position was stronger than Eleanor had characterized it, and because I wanted Lily to have the continuity of the same window and the same maple tree she had watched change through every season of her life. She knows this tree now with the comfortable familiarity of something that has always been there. She knows its shape in winter, bare and particular against the sky. She knows the first gold of it in October. On mornings when I wake up before her and make coffee in the kitchen with the yellow tiles, I sometimes stand at that window for a moment before the day begins, holding the warm mug in both hands, watching the light move through the branches. I lost something in all of this that I will not pretend I didn't lose. I lost the idea of a family that extended beyond the two of us in a way that was safe. I lost the version of Eleanor that I believed in for 5 years, the warm, silver-haired woman with the cashmere blankets, and I know now that version was constructed for my consumption, but that doesn't mean the loss of it was uncomplicated. I lost, in some irreversible way, a certain quality of openness that I had before, the readiness to give information freely, to assume goodwill, to mistake attentiveness for love. That loss made me sharper and more careful, and I think on balance it was necessary, but I grieve the woman who didn't need to be sharp in that particular way. What I kept was Lily. What I kept was the apartment, and the maple tree and the yellow tiles. What I kept was Renata's voice on the phone saying, "I'm going to give you a name," and my mother's voice message in the hospital hallway, and Margaret's flat, precise competence across a desk that held the 11 pages of my undoing and made them into the foundation of my defense instead. What I kept was the version of myself that stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room and said quietly and without trembling what she had done and what I wanted, and meant every word of it. Some betrayals are committed by enemies. The worst ones are committed by people who learned your architecture from the inside, who mapped your walls and your vulnerabilities while you fed them tea and held the door. You cannot fully armor yourself against that kind of betrayal. What you can do, what I learned to do, slowly and at considerable cost, is understand that surviving it is not just about the legal outcome or the petition withdrawn or the name removed from a document. It's about sitting at your own kitchen table in your own apartment, looking out at a tree you know by heart, and understanding that the life you built is yours. Not because no one tried to take it, but because you did not let them.